I'm Sasha Nicole.
And I'm Star.
And I'm Dr. T.
And this is Amerikan Therapy, the definitive podcast on all things Black mental health. And we are super excited. We're back in our virtual studio today. And we have a good guest. We have a maybe controversial topic. So what's going on, Star?
All right. So today we have saved and suicidal. So something, we don't talk about in our Black community about, suicide and depression and serious mental health issues and concerns. But all of us in some way have had this in our family, if not ourselves. So we're going to have a very honest conversation. And hopefully it resonates with our audience in a way that will help someone. So.
Absolutely. So as you see, we have beautiful Miss Tari Cox, and we're extremely excited to have her. She is a woman of God. She's a self-published author, a skillful dancer. Woo. And as mentioned, Star had said she has a book that's out. It's called The Wilderness, Saved and Suicidal. She helps women overcome shame, stand boldly in their identity, and emerge into purpose. And so, just to kick that off, as mentioned, just about suicide, a lot of people don't know that recently, in a study of Journal of Community Health, showed that suicide rates among Black girls ages 13 through 19 nearly doubled from 2001 to 2017. And for Black boys in the same age group, over the same period, rates have rose over 60%. So clearly, suicide, although we don't talk about it, is it's an issue. It's an issue that's rising. It's an issue in our community. And so, Tari, talk to us. I looked at your book and I saw that you had wrote that you were desperate to end your life, but God had moved, and that you had done multiple suicide attempts. Like, lead us there. How did that get there?
Yeah, so one of the biggest things about my story is that I had a lot of undealt with trauma. And the thing about trauma is that a lot of people think that like it has to be something super terrible, but it's really subjective. And so for me, I had a lot of wounds of rejection, abandonment. I came from a really great family, but as a child, I always knew that I felt more down than I should. And so because, being in the Black community and my family, I'm the first person to ever actually seek mental health treatment. So back then when I was a kid, like I never got treatment for those types of things. All I did was just, I just thugged it out. And because I did that, it came up later on in life. And so one of the biggest things that I talk about in my book is that I used accolades to try to cover up all this stuff that internally I was just very unhappy about. So that's from graduate school to research publications, all these types of things. Like on the outside, I was a successful Black woman, and I am, but inside there were so many things that I had never dealt with internally. And I ended up in a relationship that was extremely toxic, and not to say that that was the cause of it, but that was kind of the cherry on top. And so with that relationship, the way that God kind of revealed to me everything that was going on was through that. And so I didn't really, I didn't want to be here anymore. I was very desperate to end my life, as I mentioned, as a means to escape more than anything, because the process that I knew I had to walk through, I didn't know how I would do it because there were so many things that I knew I had to face. I had just moved. I had just got out of grad school. The relationship that I was in, I was convinced that, it was going to last, and it was an ongoing relationship for a couple of years. So it was just a lot that came to a head on top of everything that I had never dealt with anyway. So that's kind of what led into that season of depression, which led to the suicide attempts.
What was it that I love that you talk about that your trauma subjective, and it's not like, you had a horror story, but you lived a horror story in your mind. Look, we right here with it. Look,
yeah,
we buddies in that.
Yeah.
But can you talk to like what was it leading up to your first attempt? And you've had multiple that said, okay, I got to get help because. One of the hardest things for me was that I didn't have, like you said, I didn't have like this trauma, this story that a traditional trauma story. So I'm like, well, I should be good. Like, why do I feel like ish, but I should be good because I didn't get raped, or, you know, things that the traditional what you think of as leading to someone being suicidal. Like, can you talk through like that process of like thinking about getting help, and like what is like obviously the attempts, but that was like, okay, I need something more than maybe even just praying it away, even though that's core.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I actually addressed that in my book, because my mother has been through everything you can possibly think of. She is very resilient. But in that, I realized that I looked to her kind of as the standard of like, well, if she can get through all that and she's, you know, fine, then like, Tari, like you're good. And it's interesting because when I was in undergrad was the first time that actually a research professor of mine that I was really close with, I kind of looked at her as a mother figure. She was pretty much like, Tari, I think you have some mild depression going on and some mild anxiety, because I was just like talking to her about life, really. And I was like, like I just didn't do anything about it in undergrad. And I think that's one of the biggest things, is that when you neglect your mental health, it will peak, it will come to a surface. And so the fact that I did that pretty much carried on into when I was in a very rigorous graduate program. It was a huge culture shock. I went to a HBCU, then went to a PWI, like, yeah, woo-hoo. But went to a PWI. It was a lot of things that I was just so like, gosh, like I was just so big on just getting through stuff. And then I finally got to a point where I couldn't. And so it was actually a colleague of mine that in graduate school, she said, she kind of, I don't even know how to describe it, but I ended up seeking therapy, but not exactly because I wanted to. In a way, she kind of tricked me. Like it was interesting because like, yeah, she did. Our counseling center at the time, before I did my practicum there, they offered free therapy sessions to all students. And because I was a grad student, you know, that included me. And it was one day we were just walking, and the next thing I know, we were on the floor for counseling. And she was like, so yeah, let's look into this. And I was just like, okay, whatever. Like, you know, and one of the biggest things that I knew like was an indicator of the fact I need to be there was my first session. All he did was say, tell me about why you're here. And I bursted out in tears. Completely. Like, and I was just like, I don't know why. Mind you, at this time, I wasn't even entirely suicidal. So you can just imagine how much was buried underneath, you know? So that was really the first time that I had, I guess, sought therapy, but it really wasn't even me saying, hey, I need help. It was really, you know, my friend at the time. And during the period that, you know, things start to get worse for me, then I continued to go to therapy, and I continued to go. Like I really did. I knew that it was something I needed to do. So that's kind of what it looked like for me. It wasn't something that I willingly said, hey, let me get some help. And that in itself is, I mean, we can speak on that as Black women. I think that's like really what we're notorious for, is not knowing when we need to get help. Because like I said, extremely successful. I'm the first one in my person to make it this far. You know, like it's just on the outside, I looked like I had it all together, but inside I was slowly dying. So yeah.
Dr. T, chime in here with you know, Tari talks about just she goes to therapy. She wasn't even suicidal at that point. Is there, and you know, maybe we need to talk about this more on another show, of sometimes it's like people feel like, I've heard people say, I don't even want to go to therapy because they feel like it will make the problems worse.
I mean, one of my favorite, you know, Black women stories, the way that Tari just described, I was working a Black Women's Expo in Chicago, and I was working a booth doing the free depression screenings. And so, you know, you're at a Black Women's Expo, everybody's loud, it's party atmosphere, and we're hawking free depression screenings. And
Yeah.
I asked, you know, this woman who just was walking past, I said, you know, could I interest you in a free depression screening? You know, blah, 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 blah. She said, girl, if I did your screening, you would put me in the hospital. She's walking around. She's at this fair. She's jubilant. She's with her friends. But this is the burden that many Black women carry. It's, you know, we've talked about this. People used to say it's a luxury to take care of your mental health. And we are trying to get people to get away from that language. Because it's not a luxury, it's a necessity, it's mandatory, it's the foundation. But so many times as Black women, we are carrying the weight of, you know, our ancestors, our children, our husbands, our community. And I don't think it's that we don't know that we need help. I think we're afraid to stop and admit that if we don't do it, who's going to do all of this stuff? So it's like that superwoman syndrome. That if I'm not carrying all this load, then not only is my life going to be affected, but all these people who depend on me, their lives are going to be affected. And so we hide behind our responsibilities. We hide behind the people that we care about as one of the rationales to not take care of ourselves. And in the end, that, you know, we know that stress and depression make other health conditions worse. So if you aren't taking care of your mental health, if something happens to your heart, you're going to have a harder time recovering. There's plenty of studies that show that. If you have cancer, it's going to be harder for you to recover. If you have any basic physical health issue, because you haven't taken care of your mental health, your physical health is going to suffer and be that much harder to recover. So the lies that we tell ourselves to get through each and every day end up hurting us in the long run. And some people never kind of deal with it. Some people snap, if you will, and deal with it. Some people accidentally find themselves in a therapist's office, you know. And it's so common, the story that you tell, Tari, that, you know, people come into your office as a therapist or a doctor and you're like, why am I here? I mean, why are you, you know, how can I help you? That's usually what I start with is, how can I help you today? And the first thing they say is, I don't know. And then the next thing is like, okay, 24 hours later,
Yeah.
Lay on the couch, like,
right.
so I don't know, but Tari, and this is probably like Tari and Dr. T, because I'm glad, love that you share your story, because I think your story may be, and I don't know the stats or whatever, I'm not the clinician, Dr. T is, but maybe the more common type of depression that many, or at least in certain class genres or whatever, are actually dealing with. And like, we're like, no, I'm good, because everything optically looks and on paper is good. Can you tell, like, do you know what your friend heard? Or like Dr. T, what should we, those that are listening, and should we like be listening for when we're having those conversations about life with our friends, that made your friend say, you need to, I'm going to make sure you need help, and I'm going to facilitate it?
Yeah, so I actually, my master's degree is in clinical psychology, which makes it even more ironic that, you know, this is something I went through. But there are a lot of ways, and I'm sure that Dr. T, she can speak to this. There are a lot of ways that depression can present, but it doesn't have the same face. I didn't necessarily need anybody to tell me that like I was depressed. It's interesting because sometimes I just didn't want to take on the identity of it. And because I was kind of like, depressed for what? Like, Tari, what are you depressed for? Like, you're like, oh, okay, you're in a graduate program that's really rigorous. Like, yes, the culture shock. Like, so you're just a little down. You got to get through it. But I think my friend, because she was also in a school psychology program, but we had some of the same core classes together. I think it was very easy for her to look at me based on our training to say like, you need to talk to somebody. At the time, again, I had never mentioned any, I didn't have any suicidal ideation. I hadn't mentioned suicidal thoughts to her, but I think she could just tell that I was extremely unhappy. And one of the biggest things that I dealt with was increased irritability. And so like at the time, you know, that is a depressive symptom, but back then I didn't realize that like, you know, that was actually a depressive symptom that I was dealing with. I thought it was kind of normal because of everything, you know, I was in a really tough graduate program and everything. But even like the sound of music was irritating me, like something as simple as that. Now looking back, I can go like, wow, you know, as somebody that walked through it. But I think that's like a really important thing to be mindful of, is that depression doesn't have one face, but there are some common symptoms. And, you know, when you just start hearing people talk about hopelessness, and then again, some people don't talk about it. Like, that's the thing. That's why it can be so dangerous, because there are people that walk around depressed with a smile on their face. I was one of those people. So, you know.
Well, and yeah. I evaluated a teenager today, and it was very hard for the family to acknowledge, like, they talked all around this kid is depressed, right? And they were like, well, sometimes he says he just wants to get in a car and go far away and never come back. And I'm like, what? Like, it's like, so, and I said, so have you been feeling depressed? And they're like, no, he doesn't feel depressed. He just wants to go away and never come back and never interact with his life and never be around the people that he knows. And I'm like, okay, well, like, how far are we trying to drive? Like grandma's house or whatever. And they're like, well, he just wants to drive to London. Now, you know what happens if you get in a car and try to drive to London, right? Like everybody in this room is smart enough to know that. So it's so hard for people to just acknowledge. And I mean, I think that's another great example of what Tari was saying. Like, they never said the word suicidal, but this kid was suicidal, right? And so every family has their own hidden language around how they communicate things that are difficult to talk about. And this is one of those things. And so it definitely, especially in people of color, because we have carried these traumas and burdens and wounds for so long, it becomes normalized, right? That we all suffer, we're all tired, we're all, we all have to deal with microaggressions. It becomes so normalized that we forget as individuals that just because everybody's in pain doesn't mean that the pain doesn't hurt.
That's good right there.
Dr. T, how, and Tari, maybe for yourself as well, maybe even Star, is that how do we then start moving past, like, so for example, I've shared before that I used to be a cutter when I was younger. And for my mom, who, at the time, she felt like me cutting myself was not a reference of suicide, but a reference for attention. And oftentimes when people who are expressing certain things or who are showing that, hey, I'm down, it's like, it isn't until it happens or you cut an artery that it's like, oh, I never, I thought they were okay. They were just this. And then when you start to go to therapy, like even in recent years for me, I feel like sometimes the more that I go to therapy, the more down I feel. So, how do we one, start recognizing that if a person is saying, hey, like I'm hurting, but maybe they're smiling while they're saying it, or two, just in general, that how do we start beginning to unpack some of the further pain that we feel when talking about it to someone like yourself?
Yeah, so I definitely dealt with cutting as well. That's a huge part of my story. I talk about it all through my book. I think for me, like when I just think about addressing that with somebody, because it's unfortunate, like the idea of cutting and self-harm, even in the Black community, is taboo. So let alone like across the board, cutting is one of those things that people are like, you just don't understand. People don't understand things like that. But I feel like when we're talking about things like that, like it's interesting because I obviously had a very hard time opening up about it, but it was more so because I felt like it was, I experimented with it when I was younger and I never did it again. And it came back when I was a graduate student. Like it almost doesn't even make sense, because when I was, younger, it was kind of like a fad, really. And I think that's where the whole attention thing would come from, is because, there was kind of like the emo phase, and I'm not sure, like I'm maybe younger than you guys, I don't know, but there was like an emo phase that went on where cutting just kind of floated around. And so I think like the fact that it's so taboo, it makes it hard to bring up to people. It makes it hard for people to even be receptive to it, because you're going to have either one or two, responses to that. It's like, whoa, what's wrong with you? Or they're doing it for attention. Like it's never in the middle. It's never like this person is hurting, there's something clearly wrong. And, the thing about cutting too is a lot of people don't want to die when they cut. That's not everybody's story. That was mine for a period of time, and then it turned otherwise. But I think that with the idea of cutting it with pain so severe like that, it's packed with so many unspoken things that, like, as a community, if I'm honest with you, I don't really know. I feel like we're getting there. I feel like we're moving towards that, but I don't know that if we truly mastered how to have a conversation about things like that in the Black community. So, but I think that stories like mine, I say that humbly, debunks all this, facade that it doesn't exist, because it clearly does. And not just in people that, you know, don't seem to have things going for themselves. It can be the most successful people, like seriously. So yeah.
I mean, I agree with you, Tari, that in the Black community, we don't have the language, partially because we haven't allowed ourselves to feel our pain. You know, these generation upon generation upon generation. And the younger generation today, they're much more in touch with it, and they're much more trying to figure out how to explore. And there is this bridge that I think we're searching for, about how to have these conversations where the young people are like, look, I need to talk about this. I'm not about to try to do what y'all did. Like, they are really just ready to throw everything out the window. And some of the older generations are like, well, we just don't talk about those things. And that's the code language for I don't know what to say. But if you can just listen, right? They're not asking us for answers. They're not asking us for solutions. They're just asking us to be open to listen. And that's, you know, one of the things that I don't know, as a community, that we have mastered yet either, is learning to listen, because we want to fix it. Like, you don't have time to be hurting. You got to get yourself together, girl. You got to get back out there. You got to, you know, get those A's in your program, or go get that degree, or go, you know, live and get that house and that car and all of these things as evidence of your success, when what you really need to do is tap into your spirit, listen to your heart, and heal the pain, multi-generational pain, right?
Yeah.
We watch our mothers and our grandmothers just put their shoulder to the grindstone and just work and walk through all kinds of things, but they never took the time, which means they didn't teach us. And now we need to teach them. And so this is a multi-generational approach, and it may be some reverse teaching here, where the young people are going to have to be the brave leaders and teach the older generations about how to deal with the pain, how to even first get in touch with it.
Yeah, I agree.
I love that you talk about that. Can you share, I mean, this is open to everybody, but can you share about the journey of telling someone in your family? Because like my experience was, I had a nervous breakdown. I inpatient myself. I was like, okay, I gotta go somewhere. I called my medical doctor is like, here's someplace, I need you to be there at this time. You got an hour to get there. And that was like the start of like getting some help. Can you share? And for years, I never told anybody like that experience, like work, anyone, you know. And then when I did come back to work, like there was a lady, this is not funny, but it is kind of funny. You know, you can laugh at some crazy shit after you've been in an inpatient facility. Like literally, she came back the same day I did, and she was like, she had beaten breast cancer. And so like everybody was like, you know, it was very celebratory. And they were like, I came back on medical leave, and they're like, so like, you know, like what happened to you? And I was like, girl, I think I made up some story. I'll just be honest. Like, who wants to be like, oh, I was in a mental health facility or inpatient facility. So yeah, but that, you know, like, I think those are hard conversations, because I had that conversation a couple of weeks ago with a friend of mine for her daughter. And I'm like, inpatient, like it might be an answer, but that's like that you talk about inpatient, like you ain't crazy. I ain't saying no like that. Like literally, when I finally told my first friend, the first person I told, they said, "You went to a crazy bin." I was like, and this is like many years after. So Tari, can you talk about that? Like telling people, and it might not have been immediately after.
If we're talking about when I was hospitalized, that happened so fast, because I was actually involuntarily committed. It was a different scenario where I didn't voluntarily commit myself. But the first person I called was actually my oldest sister. And I live in Charlotte. My family lives back in the Burlington area. It's like almost a 2-hour drive.
I went to A&T, I know.
Okay, so you know. But I, at this point, when I was hospitalized, I had been none of them knew. I will say that. Like my mom, I believe, no, I take that back. My mom kind of picked up on the cutting when I came home from graduate school after my first year, but we didn't talk about it. I think she saw it, but nobody else knew really, like a few of my very close friends. But as far as how bad of a mental state I was in the week that I was hospitalized, nobody knew. And so first person I called was my sister, because quite frankly, I didn't know who to call. I was just distraught because, you know, there was something that led me to being hospitalized at night. And on top of the fact of being hospitalized against my will and everything that had happened to get me there, the first person I called was my sister primarily. And I think this speaks to a lot because I knew she could handle it and I knew that nobody else could. And the fact that I even had to think like that in that state, it just like, I've never even thought about this until right now in this moment. My sister is probably one of the strongest people I know, but it's a shame that we dictate strength based off of how well somebody copes with trauma. And it's just like, my sister, she's a tough cookie. Like my oldest sister, she's a tough cookie. And so when I told her, you know, I was like, I'm in the hospital. She said, for what? And I told her, I said, I had a suicide attempt. And she said, for what? That's what she said to me. And I don't say that about her in like a condemning way, but that was just her immediate response. And like, she hung up so fast. I kid you not, she got to the hospital in like, from Burlington to Charlotte, it felt like 45 minutes. I mean, yeah. But, so yeah, I told her, and then she had to deal with telling my mom. Like I knew that she would be the only person that could actually handle it without breaking completely, even though it was awful, because none of them knew how depressed I was. None of them had any idea. They had absolutely no idea. They're like, you just moved, like, you know, da 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 da, like, and it literally came out of nowhere for them. So I didn't really have to tell too many of my family members because they did it while I was in the hospital. But as far as like one of my closest friends, who she plays a very pivotal person in my book and in my story, telling her was hard. And it was only because you just never know how to tell somebody stuff like that, because it was actually like a period of time where she hadn't heard from me. She too had just moved to Charlotte. Like we were those type of friends that just like it was divine. God just really brought us together. And she's like, you know, hey, like where you been at? And I was like, Lord, like, I feel you're telling me to share this with her, but it's just so much behind it. And so I struggled to share that with her. And I feel like anybody does. Anybody struggles because, again, nobody would have ever thought. And quite frankly, another one of my best friends was pregnant with my goddaughter and like due any day when I was in the hospital. I was so scared that like they were going to be like, you know, they let you have your phone. So I was scared that I was going to miss the birth of my godchild. So it was just a lot. And I was like, it's different when people don't know that you're carrying that type of pain. It's another thing when people are kind of aware that you're in a season that's pretty dark. But I was one of those people that I'm telling you, nobody in their wildest dreams would have ever thought that would have happened to. So coming out about it for me was hard in the beginning. But after that, it got easier because I knew God was telling me that I would share my story. And it's interesting because I was already writing before I was hospitalized. The whole way that my book came together, it's just very divine. But I don't know, after a while, it kind of got easy for me to share it. But yeah.
Dr. T, how do we distinguish, like Tari said, she said there was something that led up to that hospitalization. How do we distinguish moments where it is someone who is truly going through a mental health crisis, an issue? This is a problem. This is not a stunt. This is not, oh, I just feel sad. How do we distinguish between that and someone who is possibly seeking something for attention, or who may use mental health as a way to get sorrow, among other things? Like, how is there a way that, and I think sometimes people, you know, like Tari said, who'll be like, well, for what? Like, there's nothing that you should even be. How can we know that this is not just sometimes for what, but what exists and what you're going through?
Well, I mean, I think that's a great reminder of people that everybody has pain, right? You know, some people in the discrimination and diversity movement, there's been this conversation about suffering, right? everybody has suffering. Now, every suffering may not be equal, but everybody has suffering. So even if somebody is doing it for attention, if that's the only way they know how to get compassion from someone, isn't that a problem?
Yeah.
Right? Like, why is that less of a problem than somebody else's problem? So they still got a problem, right? So we need to learn to listen to people. And, you know, one of the things that I ask when I do an evaluation, especially if someone who's cutting, so I'm glad that we're talking about this, because people are like, well, why and for what? And I always ask the question, how does that help you? Because then the person can tap into what they're dealing with. They give you an avenue to explain what their pain is. Are they numb? Are they this? Are they that? Right? It changes the dialogue. We talk a lot on this show about peer support, which means people helping people. You don't have to be a professional to try to figure it out. You just have to be open, right? And so most of the time, people are trying to communicate their pain, and it's difficult and it's hard to hear, it's hard to receive. And so it often gets brushed off or doesn't get heard or doesn't get validated. And so the person just carries the pain to the next person. That, you know, the literature shows that people who attempt suicide have sought help in the 30 days before. Almost 100% have sought help in some way, from a healthcare professional, from a pastor, from a friend. So most of the time when people are in these spaces and places, they are trying to figure out a little window where they can let some light in and see if there's someone who's willing to walk the journey with them. But the rest of us are so, you know, caught up as well that we just miss the cues. And so, and we're not always open because it's not comfortable. You know, it's girl, you'll get over him. Girl, that ain't girl. Right? You know, that's that lip smack that says.
I unfortunately had somebody tell me, and again, you have to have a level of grace when you're kind of trained in this field, that not everybody is going to respond appropriately or know what's inappropriate. But I did have somebody tell me one time, "You too pretty to be doing that." And I was like, so confused because I didn't know how to take it, but it almost felt like just another kind of like well, Tari, you have nothing to be doing that for. So it put me in a box of feeling like, why are you doing this to yourself all over again, which led to more condemnation and everything else. So yeah, it's just interesting, the level of like how unfortunate it is that, you know, we don't talk enough about this type of stuff. I think that in our community, we're moving towards being more open about healing from trauma. That's kind of the trend right now in the Black community, like heal from your traumas. But I don't think that we've scratched the surface of suicide and self-harm and things like that. I think it's just so uncomfortable, like you said.
I think the comments you get are like, at some level, people themselves are scared of not just the topic, but of what does that mean for me? Like, because I'm going through some things I'm not telling anybody about. I'm waking up every morning and feeling like I need a new life. I'm chasing external because what's inside is I can't even consume it. Like, you know, I teach meditation, and some of the classes that I've taught in and actually in the facility I went to a few times. And for a lot of people, it's just, I can't consume myself because myself is it's so dark inside that I can't. Right. That's not something I can consume. So a lot of the backlash, like if I look back, and I didn't obviously, you know, didn't have the hindsight then, I look back now, a lot of it, and people have come back to me that said nasty things to me, you know, when I told them 10, 12 years ago what was going on, that have now come back and said, hey, do you know a place I could go? You know, asking those types of questions. But it was more, now I know it was more about, well, what does that mean? Does that mean I'm crazy and with the air quotes, or does that mean I'm getting ready to have something wrong with us? And so I think part of, like, especially in HBCU culture, I feel like there's so much talk of success and striving so hard to go so high because we're sitting on the shoulders of giants. I think the discussion though has to be, we have to get a level of comfortability with that. Everybody will have a breaking point. Like not may, it's will. It's when it's going to happen. It may not end up in suicide, or it may not end up in cutting, but it will come out in other ways. It will come out in going broke, or it will come out in, you can't stop having sex with you see. So I now have that hindsight of like, oh, that was your suicide attempt. That was your committing yourself. And Dr. T, can you talk about inpatient? Because like I was thinking about the show earlier this morning, and one of the things that like keeps coming to me is that how we look at inpatient. Because I'm be honest, inpatient saved my life, and it was something I didn't want to do. I think I might have been tricked, because when Doc was like, I'm like thinking, I'm good. I ain't got no bag. I ain't got nothing with me. She's like, just you need to be there at 1 o'clock, no later. Can you talk about inpatient, demystify it, and like who is it for? Because I think we should use it before we get to the hospital stage.
Well, here's the trick of the healthcare system today, and this is a very, very sad, unfortunate truth. Inpatient is not what it used to be, right? Under today's insurance market, and let's be clear, that's what drives healthcare today, right? Under today's insurance market, inpatient psychiatric hospitalization is primarily used for extreme danger to self or others. So you have to have an express, clear danger to yourself or other. But even though inpatient is less of an option, and the other thing, let me just say this to be clear, that when you go in inpatient, it's going to be much shorter than it used to be. And they're probably going to recommend medication on the first day, because the goal is to get you in, get you on medication, get you out, you can get your therapy at home, right? It's not like it used to be. However, because inpatient is like that, there are many more different levels of care than there used to be. So there is something called like partial hospitalization, where you go to the hospital or a clinic, depending on how your system is set up, for 3 to 5 hours a day, and you have group therapy and you have individual therapy. You meet with nurses and doctors, and there's other people who are struggling, but then you go home at night. So those are people that are still in crisis, but they're deemed safe enough to be able to sleep at home. And then below that is intensive outpatient. And so intensive outpatient may be 2 to 3 hours a day, 3 to 4 days a week, same types of services, but you're doing, you're going home in the evening. And so, and then you have, more general outpatient, and then you have therapy, and then you have medication management. So there are many different levels of care now, where we used to have inpatient and outpatient, right? And so now there are many different levels of care. So yes, you can go and get help and support before you're in crisis, before you're a danger to yourself or others. But that means that we have to acknowledge that the pain is real, that the pain is causing us problems, and it's interfering with our happiness or our joy. I say that Black women, we oftentimes walk around like that kid in the Peanuts cartoon with that dark cloud over our head. We're showing up at every event. We're participating in every activity. We're doing everything we need to do, but there is this dark cloud that we just can't fully quite embrace and experience the joy that should be a result of all these things that we're taking a part of. And that's a way that we know that we should be getting some help and support, because we deserve the same level of joy, the same level of fulfillment, the same level of happiness that other races and other genders enjoy.
Tari, as we close out, like, what is there anything you want to point out in your book that you'd like to say and leave us with? Anything, and even beyond the book, that you'd want to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, so a huge part of obviously my title is that I am saved. I'm a believer in Christ. And I think that in itself is what makes the book so controversial. It's what makes my story so controversial, even if I hadn't turned it into a book. But I am an advocate of therapy. I'm an advocate of medication, but I'm a huge advocate of the power of God. And so I believe that all of those coupled together produce freedom. And I don't believe in the narrative of pray it away. Now, I do believe that Jesus breaks chains because I'm a product of that. I would not be one of those people that could confidently state the power of God without having walked through it. Because, you know, there are some people that have grown up in church and things like that, and they can just say, just pray it away. I didn't grow up in church. I developed my own relationship with Christ when I was about 18. And it wasn't until I went through this dark season that I came to truly know who he was. So through that, I can confidently state, like, I fully believe that freedom is available for everybody, but I never push the narrative that prayer is enough. I believe that therapy is the weapon for to combat all this stuff. Prayer is, you know, also a weapon. And I think that in the church, it's becoming more apparent that, you know, not just in the church, but leaders, because I believe, I think it was like last summer, there was a pastor that died by suicide, and he was actually an advocate of mental health. So people knew about, you know, his struggles. And when he died by suicide, I think that kind of like, you know, woke the church up a little bit. But I just wanted to kind of throw that out there because, and I wish that we could have talked about it more, but that's okay. I really do think that there's this narrative in the church of just pray it away. And as somebody that walked through it, somebody that's also clinically trained, somebody that also is a believer in Christ, like I can wholeheartedly say that God equips therapists. And, you know, if we're going to push that narrative for mental health, then why don't we push it for physical health? Like, you're not going to tell a cancer patient not to go to their chemo if they're a believer in Christ. So why do we treat mental illness like that? Or why do we treat, you know, like it's one of those things. And I really do feel like that's kind of what my story is used for, because, you know, I have all of the factors that would say that I shouldn't have went through this, but also all the factors that say, listen, I did go through this. I made it out. And it wasn't just one thing that I used. No, I didn't just pray it away. I spent a lot of time in prayer, but I went to therapy and I was on a medication regimen for a period of time as well. So I think that's really, really important. Yeah.
That like just quickly, what could we give the church? What does the church need in order to fully embrace this message? What's missing?
I would say a lack of education of what depression and anxiety really are and what they present themselves as, because I feel like in the church, a lot of people, they look at depression and anxiety as like something that's wrong with a person. And oftentimes the stuff that people walk through, if they're depressed, is not even anything that they've done. You know, it's just like undealt with trauma and a lot of things people don't talk about in the church. I'm blessed enough to attend a church that has resources available for counseling and things like that. But I don't know if all churches are like that. But unfortunately, I feel that it's stories like mine, stories like the pastor that died by suicide. I think his name was Jared. I can't remember, but it's things like that that I feel like wake up the church. I do feel like in the church it's becoming more normal to talk about these things, but I still think that we have a ways to go, because, you know, a lot of people in church and everybody in the church, you know, they aren't believers of Christ, contrary to popular belief, they're not. But a lot of people that, you know, they don't carry, I'm just speak on, they don't carry the heart of God and the heart of Jesus. He desires everybody to be free from things like this, not to feel condemned because they're dealing with something that they shouldn't deal with because they're a believer. And so I think that across the whole body, if we change that narrative to shift through a lens of Christ's love, then we'll be able to look at, okay, let me actually listen to this person that's came to the altar multiple times because they're dealing with depression. Let me actually listen to this person that, they're speaking about anxiety and they're, you know, they're praying, but they need a little something else. It's not their lack of faith. Like, I think that that's one thing that we're missing. But based on, you know, content I've been seeing, based on, you know, a lot of stuff that I've been kind of keeping up to date with, it looks like you know, we're doing better. I just think that we need to continue to educate the church on what this stuff looks like and how it doesn't have one face. So yeah.
Dr. T, you have anything else left to add?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we could unpack all of that stuff, but I'm gonna
Right.
I'm gonna resist. To say, like I have always said, that if God can make, you know, everything else, he can make therapists too. And you know, I've always said that me being a psychiatrist is my ministry, and that's what God wanted me to do. And so he uses all of us in a wide variety of ways. But what I want to remind people is suicide is the second leading cause of death in people between the age of 10 and 34. Now, just think about that. All the things that we educate people about, we educate them about smoking, we educate them about their heart disease, we educate them about obesity and the foods that they eat. And the thing that's killing the youngest people in this country is suicide. And so it's, yes, it is the Black community, but it's a larger American problem. And the Black community is a microcosm of that. And in like many other ways, inequitably affected by it. So we have to start having these conversations more. Now, thankfully, I have seen over the course of my career a huge shift in the Black church. The big Black churches, many of them have counseling centers, they have mental health ministries, they have all kinds of supports and things like that. But it's really the thing that I think is harder is those smaller churches that may not have the same access to resources and information that a denomination might provide. A lot of the smaller mom and pop that are still preaching fire and brimstone or whatever that phrase is. But the word is spreading. One of my line sisters was prominent in her denomination, and she worked a lot in increasing mental health. And it is, as Tari said, partially about education. Just like the rest of us, when we get our academic education, they don't teach us everything we need to know. And when pastors get their education, they don't teach them everything they need to know. So it's really incumbent on the pastors and the leadership of different denominations to really inform and educate their team of pastors and lay leaders so that this thing can spread throughout the church so that people can be healed, because that's why they're coming to church, to be healed. And so if we could change the conversation, and so I'll go back to that way that I asked the question. I always ask how can I help? How is this affecting you? That opens a different kind of dialogue other than what's wrong with you or why are you doing this? Because we don't have the words for the why, but we do know how. And so let's just try to change the dialogue.
That's good.
Star, what's your two things?
First, I say thank you, Tari, because I think it's important that people tell really honest stories. And the nuance of your story is so critically important. I think it's going to save a lot of people's lives, that you talk about, I didn't have anything on surface that made people say, okay, that it's valid for you to be suicidal, right? The validation of, should you be suicidal, which is a whole nother topic. We probably should get into. But I think just thank you. I know your story, as it gets out there, people please buy the book. It will save people, because they'll be like, oh shoot, that's me. Hold up, that's my cousin, So my two things for today are, the first thing is to listen with compassion, which is a hard thing, especially and I can only say as Black person, because I've only lived in one, at least this lifetime, but I've only lived as a Black woman. So I think that's a very difficult thing for us, especially as Black women, to do, to be able to listen to other people with compassion and not listening for, where do I fit in the story? Is that like me? Is that dissimilar to me? To just be present and listen, and not try to find the judgment, the shame, or, well, what does that say about me? Just to listen with compassion. And I love Dr. T out and adding in that, how can I help? Not what, not why, how can I help? And then, and go from there, but to listen with compassion. And then two, we didn't talk about it, but we've talked about it on other shows. I would say a wellness plan is critical. And a wellness plan that you carry with you throughout your life. You update it, you change it as things in your life change, because I love, Tari, that you brought up the pastor who was actually a mental health advocate. I think he was a young white gentleman.
Yeah.
And he had done a lot of work in the larger church body around awareness of mental health. I think that's a critical story, because so many of us who are advocates or are, fighting the power that will be, there's a lot of pressure and a lot of stress involved in just purporting yourself as an advocate, right? There's this sense of you should have solutions. You should be on the other side of things. So I think a wellness plan is critical no matter what part you are in your journey. And the other reason I say that is because depression specifically is a really tricky thing, because you can be good today and you can always have a smile. You can always be dressed appropriately, face beat, hair done, and you could be good one day, and then you could be suicidal literally in a moment. And it doesn't have to be, something horrific happened. It's just something clicks in the brain. Your brain starts telling those stories that aren't true necessarily. So that wellness plan becomes critical, and that you have a circle like you had, Tari. You had someone in your circle who was educated well enough on the topic and the verse, and knew you well enough to know that I need to help. This is more than just you need to go to get therapy. Let me take you to get therapy. So whatever she saw was extreme enough that she was like, I gotta make sure you get up in that place, So, and this is a journey. There will be ebbs, there will be great moments, and there will be down moments, no matter where you are. Like, at one point, I think with my depression, I was like, okay, I'm healed. I'm healed. I'm done with this. I've checked the box. I'm off meds. I don't need to go to therapy anymore. And that proved to not be true. So this is a journey, especially for those like myself who deal with clinical depression, where it is an everyday journey. It's about how the rigor and discipline of how I live my life to keep myself well, and that's perfectly fine. So that's what I got.
Yeah, absolutely. I like everything to everyone, just to piggyback off of a lot of the sentiments. I really like the compassion, like listening with compassion. I think that, and just to go back to your point, Tari, when we talk about healing, I do think that healing is the key to start going beneath the surface, because I think that it is the lack of healing and the trauma that exists within us that is the culprit for a lot of the things that we are going through. So, whether that's something that we've been through when we were a child, or whether that's something that we're just going through currently as an adult. There are people who are going through depression who didn't have any type of situations that happened to them as a child. Right. I know for me, like when mine started, it started because of childhood trauma. And I think a lot of people don't understand that trauma is a culprit of decisions. And I say that because people will be like, well, if you had made a better decision, you wouldn't be going through what you're going through. And that's where I think the compassion needs to come in, is that oftentimes you don't know what a person has gone through that has led them to possibly create bad habits and bad decisions. And I don't think that excuses it, but what I do think is that we have to have a little bit more compassion and understanding why people sometimes do or are where they are or do what they do. And so I do hope, that we're able to get to a better place, because in that healing, I think you're able to understand things a little bit better. You're able to make different decisions. You're able to recognize that when a situation may be a situation and not something that necessarily means that, you have to end your life. So there's a lot that goes into it. And, again, Tari, as everyone has mentioned, we really appreciate you sharing your story. And obviously we could go on and talk about it, especially adding in that church component, because that's a big one. So everybody, please get her book, The Wilderness, Saved and Suicidal, Tari Cox, and follow us, Amerikan Therapy with a K. We thank you all. We love you, and we out.